Good afternoon. I'm Jeffrey Archer, Dean of University Libraries, Museums, and the Press, and I want to welcome you to our Readers Meet the Authors. As we've been doing so far, I'm going to start with our land acknowledgement. And I ask that as you listen to it, not only listen to the first part where we're acknowledging, but also to think about how you or your peers or colleagues might lean into the second part. What are the frameworks for us, for our actions going forward? We respectfully acknowledge that Baylor University in Waco and its original campus and Independence are on the land and territories originally occupied by indigenous peoples, including the Waco and Tawakoni, the Wichita and affiliated tribes, the Tonkawa, the Comanche, Karankawa, and Lipan-Apache. These indigenous peoples were dispossessed of and removed from their lands over centuries by European colonization and American expansionism. In recognition that these native nations are the original stewards of Baylor's campus locations, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign nations and indigenous communities through educational offerings, partnership, and community service. Thank you for attending. What better thing to do in a library than to have author talks? We collect the print works, the journals, we pay a lot of money for subscriptions, but this is really the bread and butter. We bring faculty together for you to engage with the ideas, not just through a screen or through the printed page. Now I'll turn it over to the president.
Thank you, Dean Archer. It's wonderful to have all of you here. This is actually the fifth in our Readers Meet the Author series for this year, so we've had a wonderful series so far. We're really looking forward to today's conversation. Every year we have an outstanding selection of faculty who have written books in the previous year that we highlight, and it's a really wonderful opportunity to celebrate some of our faculty that are doing exceptional work across a really diverse set of thoughts and perspectives and disciplines on our campus. It also allows our faculty, staff, and students to gather together and discuss ideas and meet colleagues that they might not normally spend time with on our campus, and certainly allows us with those online to have a larger audience as well. This year, the Office of the Provost worked very hard and identified 7 faculty members for this series, and as I said, this is the 5th installment of the year, so we're getting close to the end as we go through the spring semester. Today, Dr. Devan Stahl has been invited to discuss her book, Disability Challenge to Theology, Genes, Eugenics, and the Metaphysics of Modern Medicine. So you've probably heard me say more than once that the world needs a Baylor. Part of that is that the world needs a Christian perspective in research and Christian influence and witness in solving and addressing some of the world's critical issues and challenges. And certainly questions of disability and genetic engineering and pivotal ethical issues of our day. And I love that Dr. Stahl is bringing a Christian perspective and witness to these really important questions because of her deep concern for people and genetic disabilities. She draws on a uniquely Christian concepts in her book, as well as the work of theologians and others in this work. Dr. Devan Stahl joined the Religion Department in 2019, and her research focuses on medicine and the visual arts, theological bioethics, disability studies, and the beginning and end of life issues. She also has 3 other edited volumes in addition to the book that we're going to discuss today. And she is joined by Dr. Natalie Carnes, who's a professor of theology who joined Baylor's Religion Department in 2011 after completing her PhD at Duke University. She is a constructive theologian who draws on literary and visual works to inspire theological reflection, bringing traditional Christian theology into conversation with the complexities of life. She's got lots of wonderful research in a variety of areas as well. So we are really thrilled to have both of you with us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you to have a conversation.
I think we're mic. Thank you. Thank you, President Livingstone, and thank you, Dean Archer. And we're excited also that Provost Brickhouse is here, and Dr. Reed, and all of you are here to have this conversation with us, because this is a really fabulous book, and it's fabulous in the ways that it's scholarly and rigorous and academic, and also shows why being scholarly, rigorous, and academic matters for how it is we move throughout the world. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation with all of you. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to look at the book yet, but the title is Disability's Challenge to Theology, and the subtitle is Genes, Eugenics, and the Metaphysics of Modern Medicine. And it's a title I really love because it has two provocations in it. The obvious provocation is in the title, Disability's Challenge to Theology, that disability has some kind of challenge or provocation to offer theology. But there's a second provocation in the subtitle, Genes, Eugenics, and the Metaphysics of Modern Medicine. And the provocation is that something as abstract as metaphysics, which I think everyone's eyes glaze over except for maybe Dr. Jeffries and Dr. Burris, we're there in the philosophy department, has something to say about something as concrete as genes and eugenics and the kinds of decisions we make about beginning of life and end of life and middle of life care. And so, Dr. Stahl, I wanted to invite you first to say more about that, how something that we might think of like as an ivory tower academic concept like metaphysics, how it is something like that matters for how it is we live in the world.
Yeah, that's a great question. So first, thanks to you all for being here and to listen to a book about metaphysics. So let me try to explain why you should care about metaphysics. So metaphysics, of course, is this kind of first principle dialogue where we talk about the nature of reality, right? What it means to be. And you can imagine how that if we stay there, that's a really academic, esoteric kind of conversation. But I think it matters because I think if we're going to treat people well, so I'm an ethicist, I'm thinking about how we ought to treat people, I have to know who these people are, how they exist in reality. And this matters to me a lot when I think about disability. So if I'm going to say we ought to treat people with disabilities really well, I need to know what I'm talking about when I say disability. And I think that there's a way in which our modern society thinks about disability in a really negative way. Disability is this bad thing that happens to people. And I think we think that in part because of the ways that modern medicine and science have formed the metaphysics, the ways we think about what disability is and how it adheres to bodies. And so part of the work that I'm doing in this book is to think through how did science get us here? And what I come to is that there used to be a way science talked, and before it was called science, when it was called natural philosophy, where you had to talk about the formal and final causes of things. So what is the meaning of a thing and what is its telos, or what is its purpose? And so we would talk about that with the body. And of course, in modern science, we get rid of those because those sound like theological or philosophical questions. And so we just talk about material and efficient causation. So what is the thing? What is the thinginess of a thing? And how can we manipulate it, right? And so when we stay there, we need theologians then to help fill in what is the purpose of a thing? What is its meaning? But I argue that Protestants, like the Protestant tradition I am a part of, mainline, particularly white Protestants, stopped doing the work of thinking metaphysically and instead just focused all on social ethics, which is why it was so ill-prepared to fight the eugenics movement of the 20th century. So mainline Protestants were very enthusiastic about eugenics. They held eugenics sermon contests, so if you want to read some good ones, they're in the book. They held fitter family contests, race betterment conferences. We were all in on eugenics because it was the science of the day and we just didn't have the tools to critique this particular kind of science. And so what I want to do in the book is try to fill back in what we would need in the metaphysics, what we would need to understand about people in order to not fall into that kind of eugenic mindset today. So that's why I think metaphysics and ethics are just two sides of the same coin.
So just like thinking more specifically about the story you're telling about like genes and eugenics there, is it like, well, there was something about like Protestantism that lent itself to this eugenics movement? Or is it like without metaphysics as kind of like buffer from just the popular trends of the day, Protestantism just sort of succumbs to whatever it is people are championing as visions of progress?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter, so that Protestants, there had been this counter-narrative, and I'm sure you've heard it, that science and religion have always been at odds, which was just a myth. That had just never really been the case. But Protestants, as they divide between fundamentalists and mainline Protestants, the mainline Protestants are just thinking, we have got to like rid ourselves of this anti-science kind of narrative. We have never been anti-science, and we need to then promote science. And of course, insofar as eugenics is the science of the day, let's just say yes to that so we can seem like elite, kind of people of the world in all the best ways possible. And there were not enough tools to say like, oh, but maybe this particular science, insofar as it's affecting people, insofar as it's thinking of some people as just unfit, might be not the way we want to go.
Okay. So I hear ethicists sort of playing this kind of role of like people who reflect on things like metaphysics and reflect on our metaphysical commitments in a way that then helps us think about how it is we live and move in the world better and make better decisions. And you use the phrase having better tools. And one thing that seems different about now as opposed to the heyday of the eugenics movement is that we have a lot more tools because bioethics has sort of exploded as a discipline. And you've been involved in this at a number of levels. Like, I mean, I'll let Dr. Stahl tell you more about it, but she is in hospitals and serving on panels and working in patients. And she has this fabulous podcast called Bioethics for the People, which is actually amazingly popular. And I do recommend it, where it's short little episodes that treat different issues and people and themes in bioethics. So anyway, I wonder if you can tell us more about how it is bioethicists in particular speak into the kind of conversations we make in our everyday life in a way that helps us not to succumb to sort of eugenicist reasoning or other forms of reasoning that might be problematic.
Yeah, so part of the work I do is in hospitals doing ethics consults. And I think most people would say, like, I have no idea what that is. And I didn't actually know what it was until I was working as a chaplain in a hospital and met a clinical ethicist and was like, this is a job that people get to do? It's an amazing thing. And so I went back and got a PhD in healthcare ethics because I thought it was just such an amazing thing to do. So bioethics as a field is just a really new field. It arises, we usually say about the 1960s in response to like rapid rise of medical technologies after the Second World War. Things like ventilators that keep people alive or at least breathing, even though they might be totally unconscious. And suddenly we have to grapple with, is this the kind of life that we want to promote? Is there too much medicine that we might be using? And then we get the exposure of some really unethical human subjects research. So things like Tuskegee and Willowbrook become exposed in the 1960s, and people go, should we just trust medicine to self-regulate? These were studies from the NIH, the federal government's funding studies that are really hurting people. Maybe we don't trust the government. And if you know anything about the 1960s, it's all about kind of counterculture and pushing against authority. So you get the rise of people who are like, maybe there needs to be outside authority that gets to weigh in. And at first it's theologians, and then it quickly becomes also philosophers and lawyers and other professions that are saying, we have things to say about ethics. We have things to say about healthcare ethics. So you get that rise. And in the early 2000s, you get the rise of the clinical ethicist. So at first it's kind of ethics committees discussing issues. And then it's maybe we need somebody more, specific in the hospital. And so that person can be full-time, or they can be like me, where I'm just a volunteer, but I go in and I round with teams. And sometimes I say, hey, are you saying that because you don't think disabled people's lives are worthy of being lived? And they say, of course, I would never say that. But so you get to sort of prod at some of these questions. And so I see it, and I see it all over when we talk about prenatal testing, talk about, how hard do you really need to push this woman? And this was my experience. It's like, are you sure you don't want all the prenatal tests? What if something is, amiss in them, right? So you kind of push this line of I think, eugenic kind of thinking. Or, does the newborn really need all this medical care? Wouldn't it be better, given all the future disabilities, that maybe we should just let them go? And you see it later in the lifespan, too, of just not trusting that people with intellectual disabilities can make their own medical decisions. You see it, some of you might remember the Michael Hickson case. This was like I got to be on NPR, which was like a really big deal, I thought.
There was a New York Times article.
There was a New York Times article that I get quoted in. But because this was a man who had paraplegia and some intellectual disabilities, and his doctor was trying to deny him a ventilator at the end of life because of his quote unquote low quality of life, which was just the doctor's judgment that and his wife says, you mean because he can't walk or talk? And he says, yes, that's what I mean. And so we might be denying people in our hospital systems critical medical care because we just don't think disabled lives are worth living. And that's kind of the worst case scenario. But I do see that in very subtle and sometimes very explicit ways. And it's just, I see my role as trying to help prompt our healthcare staff to think differently about disability.
Yeah. So when you're like speaking to NPR or the New York Times, or you're like rounding in the hospital, you're you're speaking to secular bioethicists, you're speaking with, doctors who may or may not have religious commitments, patients whose religious commitments you want to respect. But you're also, as a researcher, a theological bioethicist, and you think that, that it's important to, when we make these decisions, to consider what it means when we claim someone's human, what it means to be human. And presumably part of how we narrate that as theologians is that, what it means to be human is to be created by a creator. And we have these kind of theological categories that we might bring in to describe what it means to be human. We might use image of God. We might use the category of creation. We might use Christ as the revealer of humanity. So can you say something about what it means for you as a theological bioethicist to be engaged in all of these conversations that your theology has to inform, and yet it's not got to be part of an explicit conversation, I would assume, in the hospital or with NPR?
Yeah, I don't go, well, Jesus teaches us. Sometimes, although sometimes that does come up. It just kind of depends on who I'm talking to. But yeah, I think with providers or folks who don't share the religious tradition, and I hope we do get into that in a second, just a little bit more, because I do think Christianity shapes the way I think about these things.
Yeah.
But I do think people respond to concerns about fairness and equity, right?
Yeah.
So you don't have to be a Christian to think that we should treat people well, that we should treat people fairly, that we might be wrong about people. So what does it mean to bring in disability stories? What does it mean to say, you might be saying this person's quality of life is really low, but all the empirical evidence shows us that people with disabilities rate their quality of life the same as non-disabled people. That's a big one in the hospital, is because there's a lot of assumptions. There was just a study that came out that said 80% of physicians think that having a disability lowers your quality of life, after decades of evidence that that's not the case, right? So how do we convince our healthcare professionals that that is not how we should be understanding what disability is? And so it's just having those conversations, getting them to hear from people with disabilities about their quality of life. So that's an ongoing struggle, but it's not just with secular healthcare providers. I have this struggle in the church too. I think, many good Christians have these same kinds of biases about disability always being a bad thing that happens to somebody. So I think that can cut both ways.
Yeah. It sounded like you wanted to say something about the distinctiveness of being a theological bioethicist as well.
Yeah, so at least in the way that I write and talk to other Christians, obviously Imago Dei is going to be really important to me. So there's a kind of equalizing
Image of God.
Sorry, the image of God. We like to use those fancier terms.
Let you know we're academic.
Yeah. That's right. Non-English is always fancier than the English terms. Yeah, so if we're made in the image of God, that gives us a special status. Although I think Christians have often thought our special status is maybe connected to our superior rationality, and I argue against that in the book. I don't think that's what makes us special. I just think we are, and there's a kind of a quality then that all humans share as being made in that image. And of course, we're made in the image, which is Christ is the image of God, and we're made in that image. And so we look to Christ and Christ's body to help inform us about what it means to be human. And what Christ's incarnation shows us is that to be human is to be vulnerable, is to be fragile, to be dependent. And those are not qualities of ourselves that we should hate or abhor, but these are kind of what makes us human. What makes us like Christ is that we are also fragile and vulnerable and dependent. So Christ shows us that in the incarnation, coming as a baby, the most kind of vulnerable and dependent human there is, and then dies, and then gets resurrected with the marks of his crucifixion on his body. So there's something about our vulnerability that stays with us, even as we imagine the perfect body. Because I think we imagine sort of the resurrected body in the kingdom of God as if there's an ideal body that God's trying to show us, it's that one. And that one bears wounds. And what does that mean for our Christian life together and how we should understand disability and fragility and vulnerability?
Yeah, I think that part of your book is really powerful. And part of how you take these bodies that are seen to be in the margins, but you don't see them as the margins of humanity. So maybe you can say more about how you see the kind of role of the disabled body in relation to our humanity.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I count myself as part of this disabled community, that if we are vulnerable and we are dependent and we're fragile and that's just what it means to be human, that being disabled is normal. That's just part of the normal human condition. And that manifests uniquely in some people as disability and in other people differently. So our embodiments are unique, but that we shouldn't be surprised by disability. And we shouldn't then immediately want to jump to like the fall and sin, which a lot of Christians do when we talk about disability. It's just part of the normal human condition.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful because it centers sort of the person with disability as revelatory of the human condition, and it's all the ways you've been narrating is also sort of revealed in Christ, who himself is sort of vulnerable and fragile and all of these things that we like to pretend like we're not, but we all know we are. And like, God willing, we're all headed toward an end of life that is long and where we'll increasingly find ourselves disabled. And I appreciate the way that, like, as you're holding that, like the person with disabilities is like revelatory of the human condition, you also want to hold on to the kind of uniqueness. You don't just sort of like assimilate disability, like, well, we're all disabled, so therefore there's no such thing as a person with disabilities. You want to hold on to the kind of description of a person with disabilities, and you give a person with disabilities also a kind of unique role that you can talk about with this book, but I also think connects with the work that you're doing in your next book in really interesting ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the next book is going to be about wonder and the Christian tradition of thinking about especially children who are born with extraordinary bodies as being revelatory of God's love of diversity and God's continual surprise in creation. So it's not that God creates and then goes, okay, go forth and I'll just like stand back and watch, but that part of the creation story is that God continues to be participatory in creation, continues to create, and that when things in nature, including our own children, surprise us, that's part of God saying, like, don't be too settled in your categories. Don't think you get it all. I'm still active, I'm still surprising, and I'm going to create wonder in you, even when you look amongst your own people.
Yeah. Can you say something about the particular kinds of bodies that you're thinking about in this book?
Yeah, so I'll do, so this comes from Augustine, has parts in The City of God where he talks about things that he's hearing in the community, that there are children born conjoined. So conjoined twins, which is just, isn't it like unfathomable that they could have survived like pregnancy and birth with conjoined twins, but they did. And so he hears about, I hear in the nearby town, there are these conjoined twins. And some people think that we should be afraid of them. I say they are a wonder from God, that if God can create these bodies, then your body is also wonderfully and fearfully made. And so don't be fearful of those who look different. Embrace them as part of our human community. So, and then who we used to call hermaphrodites, so people whose bodies didn't evince like a clear sex, and people who were born very little, so little people. And then he talks about some bodies that seem to like traverse the human and non-human animal, and what do those sort of bodies tell us? So he's looking around the community saying there are these children born, and people in the culture seem very fearful, that their automatic assumption is that this is God's wrath, that God is trying to warn us of some impending disaster. And I say to you, it's not that. It's God's love of difference and diversity. And we should apprehend them with wonder rather than fear.
Yeah. I mean, I see like one of the trajectories I see sort of connecting these two books is you're showing how a kind of robust sort of theological, metaphysical way of thinking about human bodies can help sort of us from being too easily assimilated to the kinds of trends, secular medical trends in our culture. It can be a way, not that medicine is a thing to be feared, but it's a thing that we can sort of, that's beautiful and wonderful, and that we can bring theological resources to help us think better about. And in the same way that you did that with, the way that metaphysics could have helped us resist the kind of eugenicist movement in the 20th century, there's a way in which wonder is a way of also resisting problematic attitudes in the world about particular kinds of births and pregnancies. So can you say something about like what it is you especially want wonder to work against?
Yeah, so in disability studies, we call this the curative imaginary, in which you see a disability or a quote unquote deformity, and your impulse is to cure it. Like, we need to fix it. Like, this is wrong, and the body needs to be normalized. And so you have to separate the conjoined twins. You have to fix the genome if you can, right? So that kind of curative impulse, when we see disability, those things get married together. So instead of always seeing the disability or the deformity as something to be fixed, it's something to first be apprehended and wondered at. And only later should we consider how medicine might intervene if that body is causing a problem. But let's not assume that just because a body is different, that it is automatically a problem to be solved. And I think medicine kind of wants to because medicine fixes things, right? And so, of course, when all you have is a hammer, everything is a nail. And medicine isn't good at just saying, wow, that difference is remarkable, isn't it? I mean, I think practitioners can do that, but I don't think that that's the animating impulse of medicine. It's to fix, right? And I'm really glad that medicine's impulse is to do that for most of the time. But for myself and many other people with disabilities, we don't need to be fixed. And so constantly telling us that we do is a problem.
Mm-hmm. So how does a medical practitioner know when it is time to cure something? Are there principles from bioethics that can help medical practitioners make these decisions more justly?
Yeah, I mean, you first have to ask the person. This seems so obvious, and yet I see it both in the Christian community and in medicine. I've never met a person with an obvious disability that didn't have a nice Christian stop them on the street and ask to pray their disability away. And every time I say that, people go, oh. And every time I talk to a person with a visible disability, that has happened to them multiple times. So you become the object to be fixed, either by your goodly prayers or by your medicine. And so without ever sort of interacting with the individual to say, is this something you'd even want, right? What are your goals, right? So with every patient in the hospital, we're supposed to be asking, why are you here? What are your goals for medical care? And that seems so incredibly obvious to all of us. And yet I think in medicine, we just sort of assume a lot that well, if they're here, they clearly want to be fixed. Like, well, what do they want to be fixed? And is that clear? It's not always clear to me that we have the same idea about what this person came here for. So I think just the first thing we should do is ask. And that seems so obvious, but I think it's the thing that we sort of forget.
Yeah. The other way that the two books seem connected to me is, or there's lots of ways, but like in your first book, you're thinking about eugenics and sort of like pre-birth things, and now you're moving to birth itself in your next book. So where is the next stage of decision making, do you think? I didn't even think of that. So all the books will just sort of progress as the life cycle goes. As you get older, yeah. You'll finally get to death at the end, your last book.
Yeah. Well, we'll wait on that one, hopefully. I do want to write a book on these like life cycle issues, because I see the kind of what I'm going to call ableism, is the discrimination against people with disabilities, implicit or explicit, as being sort of present at every stage of the life cycle. You can see it pre-birth, you can see it in newborns, you can see it in pediatric care. I mean, you can see it everywhere in the life cycle. And I think I have enough accumulated stories now of just case studies working in hospitals where I could probably pull a story and then say, here's the lesson I want us all to learn from this story as it goes through the life cycle of people with disabilities.
I like that. The other thing I notice is that in learning to make better decisions, your first book is sort of commending, as we said, metaphysics, this kind of abstract philosophy, and then the second book is commending wonder, which is maybe like a posture in the world. We might associate it more with sometimes with amateurs. You might associate wonder with amateurs or with artists. You might associate metaphysics with like philosophers. And I wonder like what you see as the connection between these things, or if there is one, like what about the way that metaphysics can help us make better decisions, wonder can help us make better decisions. Are these two things related at all?
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I think wonder does get kind of, it's like an artistic.
Yeah.
And so my sister is an artist and does all the covers of all my books.
And
the
right?
podcast. And we've written a little bit about this because she makes, might not be able to see it from here. All of her art is about, she uses my MRIs and my medical narratives to like make the art. And so we do a lot with wonder because we think like, wow, like medicine can portray the body in a particular way and art can help instill a kind of wonder that I think medicine wants objective images and art wants wonder, and that's different. But I think, man, philosophy gets it, right? Lots of really important philosophers had said something like, all good philosophy starts with wonder, right? Because you have to pause and be just overcome with something, and then you want to investigate it. I think all good science starts that way too. I think most scientists you meet will say like, I'm just captivated by the world. Like I find wonder all the time. And so it's always the good posture to say, oh, this is surprising, and then not to want to master it. So this is what our work on, Darian and I's work on images does, is say, you know, there's a temptation to like say, oh, wow, this is incredible, I want to research it, and then go, okay, I've mastered the thing. But you can never master a thing, right? So there's always wonder that gets kind of brought up again and again. But for me, the idea of wonder is like both that we're never going to master another person, much less another thing, but that it should be continual and always surprising, and that all good philosophy, all good science, all good theology starts with a sense of wonder, and that's what is motivating to us. But there have been some studies that show that medical students retain their empathy at the end of medical school if they retain a sense of wonder about the human body. So there's actually some empirical evidence to show that if you can maintain your sense of wonder, you're actually like more empathetic toward people. And that's pretty important in medicine, I think, to be empathetic toward people.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought in the visual arts because you might have noticed that was sort of, it came up when President Livingstone introduced Dr. Stahl. And that the visual arts and disability was part of like what it is that Dr. Stahl is interested in studying. And one connection is the connection of wonder. Are there other connections that you see? Why would the visual arts be important for thinking about disability?
Yeah, because how we portray disability is how that's our entry into it, right? So if you see, you can, they still do this a little bit, but medical textbooks, when you're like, okay, here's Down syndrome. It's like a really sad, naked little kid with Down syndrome with black bars over his eyes, right? What are you going to think about Down syndrome if that's the primary image you're shown about what it's like, right? So it's really obvious. Like visual arts or visual images portray a lot and set up expectations for, you know, who a person is or how a condition manifests in a particular individual. But historically, like, or even textbook images of bodies that are like dislocated from their context and the rest of the body, right? A heart looks like this. Well, a heart doesn't, of course, look like that. That's how you study, and it's important to be able to sort of do that. But like, you open up somebody's body, if I tore my chest open right now, it would look nothing. Like, just to give you a visual metaphor, right? It'd be bloody and it'd be moving, like it would be like there would be a lot of sensorial stuff that would happen if I did that right now. Yeah. That would look nothing like that image. So like, how are we accurately portraying what the body is, right? Disabilities or any parts of the body. This has changed historically a lot. I mean, there used to be a way in which Vesalius's texts would like have a body in a landscape that was like a city, and like as flesh gets added to the body, the city gets more filled out. So it was trying to, and he's gesturing toward God and these figures that he's drawing. So there's this like rich history of medical illustration that has gotten pretty parsed down as medicine became more objective and more scientific. And I think there's a way to recapture that in art.
I mean, I love how you basically are giving us this vision of studying disability and bioethics that's so multidisciplinary. I mean, referencing visual arts, referencing philosophy, of course, the practice of medicine, ethics, like all of these are like part of how it is you think about what it means to be a bioethicist and to do your work. And I wonder if there's, and to help us think about disability better, and I wonder if there's like a reverse way that goes, is if there is a way that those of us who are scholars in all different kinds of disciplines in this room, that there's a way that we should be thinking, or that the centrality of disability for the human condition should be reflected better in our own scholarship. That the way that disability, the lives with disability, the fact of disability, should that change the way that we are conducting our scholarship in some way?
Yeah. Well, yes, and so it might be more complicated.
It's a very general question because
Yeah.
we have lots of disciplines. But
Sure. Well, I think for me, it's just reminding myself that everything I do and think and write is embodied and not, I'm not like a head in a vat, a brain in a vat, just like spewing out ideas, but that my knowledge of the world and my particular sort of vantage point comes from my particular embodiment, and that is true of everyone, right? So I think there's a particular kind of disability knowledge that comes from living with a disability. If you're constantly having to navigate the world in particular ways because the environment's not built for you, you come with a particular kind of knowledge, right? And that shapes the way you form your practical wisdom. And so just reminding yourself that you're not disembodied and write as if you could generalize to all bodies. So recapturing like sort of what embodied knowledge really even is. And then reminding yourself that like maybe you're missing stuff in the world because you don't have a different kind of body, and you should ask other people how they're reading a text or how they're going about their science if they have a different sort of embodiment. That you might be missing stuff that other people can help fill in because their experience of the world is different.
I mean, from my own discipline of theology, one of the things I really appreciated about the book was how there was almost this near temptation to this vision of bodily autonomy, as if we are sort of these autonomous human selves that will never sort of decay and are completely like agentially controlled by ourselves. And the kind of disciplinary autonomy we sometimes have pretended to in theology, where there was a kind of movement in Protestantism and Protestant theology in the 20th century to a kind of like independence of metaphysics. Like it was in fact chosen in some ways, a kind of disregard for metaphysics, and the way that part of that was this capturing, part of that was an attempt at fidelity to God, and part of that also was an attempt at a vision of disciplinary autonomy that in the end proved just as mythical as the vision of bodily autonomy that can also sort of distort our visions of the human. And so I appreciated the way that like, oh, we are also tempted to visions of independence and autonomy, which are words that can point out very good things, but they're also words that can point out temptations in the world, that we're tempted to that in our lives and in our substance of reflection on ourselves, but then also in the very ways we think about the work that we're creating, and how in all the things you've been saying, there's a real invitation to, well, there's a way in which bioethics has a kind of dependence upon visual representation and has a kind of dependence on the practice of medicine and a kind of dependence upon. So this kind of vision of interdisciplinary dependence that you invite us into is one I find also a challenge that I hope to take up in my own work. I want to think with you also just while you're here institutionally about Baylor. As someone who thinks deeply about disability and is actually involved in conversations about disability all over the university, what's your dream for how Baylor can be a place that's welcoming to all humans?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're doing a great job and can do a much better job. Does that sound like the polite way to say it?
It's probably true of all of us about many things.
Yeah. Right. Well, when I talk to my students with disabilities, I mean, we talk about the ways in which their professors are or not accommodating, right? So even for me, the bare minimum is that we like allow give people their OLA accommodations, and even that isn't happening for all of our students. So baseline, like, let's give people what they're owed to by the law, but that's just like baseline sort of stuff. That's like, but we as a Christian university should be doing much better than the bare legal requirement, right? So how are we setting up classrooms that invite universal design? So invite kind of multi ways of getting information and producing creative outputs, right? So that we're not just, everyone has to read the same book and everyone has to write the same paper and everybody has to show up at the same time and everything has to do at the same time. I think these are kind of restrictions that lead a lot of our students with disabilities to just not flourish because we're not adapting things to people's particular skill sets and not accommodating their disabilities. It's like one really practical way. And just like noticing around campus what is accessible and what's not. And there's ways that we can point those sorts of things out. And just acknowledging that one another exists. I think, and being upfront, and part of this work for me is just like, I'm gonna just talk about my disabilities. And the more open hopefully I can be about it, the more open others are allowed to be about it. But I can tell you, I've talked to many, many professors and staff here at Baylor who have not told anyone that they have a disability because they're fearful of being promoted, of being sort of looked at in pitying kinds of ways. And so how do we create a culture where we're just allowed to say truths about ourselves and to not have to hide what I think is like an important identity for many people? So how do we just even start a conversation about this being another important part of diversity that can sometimes get left out of conversations about diversity?
And Dr. Stahl has done in the past for our professional organization, the American Academy of Religion, seminars on universal design. And so hopefully you'll do some at Baylor at some point, because I know a lot of us would benefit from just knowing what are the things that I can do to make my readings more accessible to people who might have visual disabilities or so on and so forth. So thank you so much. We have time now for your own questions. And we have this
Cool box.
This catch box. I am warned that Dean Archer does actually throw it, so have your best athletic arms out.
Thank you. Thank you, Devan, Natalie. Wonderful, fantastic. So I want to go all the way with what you're saying, Devan, but there's a way in which what you said could be interpreted as anti-technology in a sense, or anti-science in a sense, and for a university kind of revving up to engage AI in significant ways. How do you think what you just said about embodiment and about kind of disabilities and how we actually function as human beings in relation to that discourse? I know that's a lot, but.
No, great question. So to clarify, not anti-science, not anti-medicine. Super grateful for the ways medicine has been able to help me. And actually, I think we sort of ignore this, but like some of my favorite inventions have been made for or by people with disabilities. And I was thinking this morning about like in the past week, so electric toothbrushes, love my electric toothbrush, was made for people with disabilities. Typewriters, which become keyboards. Screen reader, obviously, so text to speech on our phones. Like how often are you in the car just like talking to somebody through your phone to make it into text? Audiobooks, I love a good audiobook. So there's so many things actually that we all benefit from in our society, I think we would agree, that were made for and by people with disabilities that become sort of really important inventions for all of us. And this is called the curb cut effect. Like a lot of us benefit from curb cuts, even though they weren't maybe designed for strollers and grocery carts, but they have that secondary benefit. So I think I'm for a lot of technology. I'm not like, against it, but I think how do we create technologies that benefit a wide swath? How do we think about universal design even within technology? There's ways in which I'm sure AI is going to be really beneficial for people with disabilities and people without disabilities. We just need to proceed in an ethical way. This is always the bioethicist caveat is like, yes, but, or yes, and let's think about how to do this in a way that's ethical. And I don't think that there's an easy answer to that on every technology, but I'm pro-technology, I'm anti-technologies that want to overcome and eliminate the disabled body. So that's the eugenic impulse I want to resist. But man, people with disabilities use assistive technologies quite a bit, are used to integrating technologies into our bodies. So let's celebrate the ways that can aid people without having to like eradicate people.
This is more of a comment than a question. I just love the work that you do, and I know you're not the only one focused on disability, but as you spoke about how we can embody the work of disability and care for those of all types on our campus, I couldn't help but think of a quote from Dr. Milo Rediger. He's a former president at a sister institution, very fond of saying that love prompts more than the law demands. And so that, your talk about OLA accommodations, this seems like the right place to do this sort of work in disability, to allow our faith here at Baylor University to animate the work that we're doing. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So you were talking a little bit about like how we portray. How we portray. Oh, it's a microphone. I didn't realize. How we portray both visually and like verbally the way we interact with disability, especially in like viewing it as something to be fixed. How do you recommend we go about conversations and like just social interactions in a way that actually promotes like inclusion and celebration of difference, while also like praising like the different aspects of people that are like beautiful and excellent, and like across disability and across like able-bodied.
Yeah, so there's no like one easy answer to this. But I think my answer is just like befriend people and get to know them and celebrate what obviously needs to be celebrated without being patronizing, right? So yeah, I think there's a temptation too in disability discourse to do what is sometimes called inspiration porn, which is, oh, it is so amazing that you got out of bed and that you're here today. Like, it's so amazing that somebody asked you to prom. It's so amazing that you actually got food for yourself and are sitting there eating it, right? So there's a way in which sort of you're swinging the pendulum away from like, oh, it's so sad and terrible, to like, look at you in the world being an actual person. Good for you. It makes me feel really good to celebrate that about you, which is not about that person, is totally about you. And so that's a temptation we should avoid too. And the only way to like avoid both of these is just to get to know people. To really invest in people, to have friends. I mean, I think if you don't have any friends with disabilities, that's a problem, right? Because we are 27% of the population. So you definitely know people with disabilities. So what does it mean to be able to talk about that? And the only way you can do that authentically is to just be friends with people.
We do have a question online. Shannon Eschman asks, what would you say to someone who claims that an acquired disability, TBI resulting in intellectual impairment, makes someone a fundamentally different person from who they were before the event occurred?
Ooh, questions of identity are really good ones that I've written a little bit about and are kind of perplexing to me. But I do think, though, you know, the ways in which our minds and our bodies interact with the world do shape who we are. And so any sort of big event could change the way that we fundamentally relate to the world and relate to our bodies. So I think that's entirely possible. Do I want to say that's a new identity, or you're a different person? I don't know. I think that's maybe a little bit more complicated. But I do think that we're shaped by our bodies. When our bodies fit with the world in a particular kind of way, or misfit with the world in a particular way, that is going to totally shape how it is that we interact and think. And actually, I think it even changes the way we acquire our moral sense. So it's, insofar as embodiment does all those things, acquiring a new embodiment can do those things too. So I want to say that that's a fundamental change in a person. Yeah.
Thanks, Devan. What a wonderful conversation. I just would love you to say a little bit more about beyond the sort of the legal requirements, how your own work shapes your pedagogy.
Yeah, good. So I won't be unique in this, but I do think about the diversity of authors that I'm bringing to my students. I try to give a little background on the authors that I'm having students read so that they know a little bit about who this person is, because I think it matters. And so trying to, and I will always struggle with this, because I think that disabled people will struggle to reach the kind of academic rigor, excellence that an ableist academic sort of world aspires to. And so, but just trying to create as much diversity in what they're reading, both sort of the scholarly authors, but then also trying to bring in first-person narratives into the work that I do. My students right now are volunteering at the ARC, and so, what does it mean to learn from somebody who isn't an academic, who has a different sort of embodiment or intellectual capacity? What does it mean for you to interact with somebody as a mentor who's teaching you about embodiment? So varying up kind of what it is people are being exposed to. It's not just academic stuff, and even there it needs to be a little bit more diverse. And then thinking with people about like what is going to be helpful to you in a future career, and so how do I create some opportunities for different assignments? A lot of my students right now are doing podcasts. I don't know if that's just because they know I do a podcast, but how do you do your scholarship in a public way that's going to benefit a lot of people outside of the academy? So just thinking about how to like diversify the stuff that we read, the stuff that we're asking our students to do. So a celebration of diversity happens like on all of those levels.
Hi, so I loved what you said about like sort of creative and flexible learning environments, and I was homeschooled and I'm an OLA student, so I like definitely support that, and I've had a lot of experience with that. But I also really appreciate like academic standards, both as something, and like structure, both as something to strive for, but also sometimes for me an indicator of like, okay, this isn't a strength of mine, and like a guideline to help me discover what my strengths are. So how do we kind of find that balance between like maintaining structure and these standards, but also having creativity and flexibility?
Yeah, wow. You're a student? That's such a great question. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, so sometimes what sort of pushback you get when you start talking about universal design is that you're like, this is the lowest common denominator. We're like lowering standards by creating more opportunities. And that's definitely not what I'm doing. I'm not saying like, if you create a podcast, I'll just like love whatever you do. No, there's still a rubric. There's still like certain measures that have to be sort of met. So I'm not saying universal design then makes everything just like, whatever it is you want to do is fine by me. It still has to have, and this is what's hard about universal design, is now I have 47 different rubrics for 47 different projects that people could do. That's an exaggeration, of course. But yeah, so you have to then sort of create what the standards are. So creating more diversity of opportunity doesn't mean that you lower the standard. It just means that you have to create standards for the project that's being assigned. And so having flexibility requires more front-end work on my part, but I hope, and you'll have to ask my students after when I can't hear, is like, but I think that creates opportunities too.
They're over there.
Yeah, they're over there.
Go ahead.
Hi, Devan. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing about your book. I'm just curious, so I work for the Baylor Center for Developmental Disabilities, and I personally do not have a disability, but being an advocate in the work and like on Instagram or wherever it may be, and not having a disability myself, like what's the best way to be an advocate without being like, you know what I mean? Because someone said to me the other day, it was one of your students, she was like, it's hard with the disability minority group because it's actually one of the very few minority groups in which most of its advocates actually aren't in that identity. Like if you see an African American group, like, and it's a advocacy group, almost everyone there is going to be African American. And then hopefully there's other people there collaborating, but that's like the base. Whereas with disability advocacy groups, it's like almost like non-disability. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So just what's the best way to be an advocate as someone who doesn't have a disability?
Yeah, so I would say part of that is amplifying the folks in the group that you're trying to advocate for, as sort of amplifying their voices, meaning like getting their stories out, prioritizing their voices insofar as that's possible. For some folks in the disability community who are nonverbal or have profound intellectual disabilities who cannot sort of advocate for themselves, it's going to be necessary to be an ally that does speak on behalf of a population, and you just have to figure out the most responsible way to do that. So a lot of the work that theologians of disability are doing right now is like ethnography work, which is embedding yourself in a community and then doing kind of participatory work with that community, gleaning what you can from interactions with people and trying your best to authentically represent what they've said, what they do in a space, and then tailoring your research to that, rather than just sort of saying, I interacted with a friend and here's all the things that they taught me, right? They are the moral object of a lesson that I learned, which is a lot of early work in disability did that. It's like, oh, this person is teaching me so much about what it means to be a good person. So like that person's not really a person anymore. They're an object to learn from. And that's a real danger that we can have. So how do we amplify other people's voices? How do we sort of authentically represent other people's experience? That's hard work. And so it just takes a lot of imagination and new kinds of research methods that I think can help to do that.
Thank you. If I may, I'd like to push a little bit more on the topic of the online question, and that is how people change over time. We have this thing, I'm sure you're accustomed to dealing with this a lot as a bioethicist, and that is medical directives. As an able-bodied, healthy person at the age of 40, you think this is what you want when you're 80 years old, and it's legally binding when you're 80 years old, but conditions have changed rather dramatically. How do you as a bioethicist handle that?
Yeah. Whew, okay. Yeah, you're hitting really at the heart of like a tension that I feel is that, so thankfully it's rare that somebody has not updated their advanced directives in 40 years.
Okay, that's
It does
good.
sometimes happen, and only like 25% of people ever bother filling them out, so they're somewhat rare. But I do try to talk to people about, I think medical directives can be really important. And in fact, I'm doing a project right now about how they can be important when you have dementia to sort of anticipate who can help you make decisions in the future. It's a project that Dr. Barron and I are doing. So I think they can be incredibly important. But the huge caveat, which I think you're getting at, is that people imagine what it's going to be like to live with, especially with disabilities in the future. Something like 80% of people would say that they'd rather die than be incontinent. That's not true. I mean, they think that now, but they get to that point and their lives are just fine. So we can, if we do not frequently interact with people with particular kinds of disabilities, we can just imagine their lives as terrible. So part of that good work too then is, what is it like? How do I exist with people with conditions that I might one day have? And how do I interpret kind of what their state is? And that's asking a lot of people to do. I have to follow advanced directives because they're legally binding, but I think on the front end, talking with people about what do you imagine that state would be like, right? How are you getting that information? Did you have a firsthand experience of that with somebody that you love and that really informed it? Or are you just saying, gosh, that sounds terrible, please just let me die if that ever happens, right? So if we really want informed consent, which I think we do in medicine, how do we provide the kinds of information that people need to make really serious medical decisions in the future? Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Round of applause for our author.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your work. I'm excited about the opportunities here at Baylor to continue doing work in this very, very important space around faith and disability. And thank you to Professor Carnes for your probing questions and helping us all better understand why we should care about metaphysics.
Anytime.
I would like to point out that we do have books in the back here, and you're able to purchase a book as well as maybe even get a little bit of a signature on a book if that's important for y'all. So I would like to also invite you to the next Reader Meet the Author event, which will be Wednesday, March 13th, which is right after we return from spring break. And that will be David Smith's book, A Force at Sea, George Dewey and the Rise of the American Navy. So I'm looking forward to that. He will be interviewed by Ron Johnson in the History Department, and I hope that I will see you there. Enjoy the rest of your day.